The moment you believe you are not enough is the moment your life begins to shrink without you even noticing. Lucas Bennett stood outside a tall glass building in downtown Chicago, holding a folder with his resume, staring at his own reflection in the door as people walked past him with confidence he could not explain, his heart beating faster with every second he waited, his mind whispering the same words it had repeated for years. You are not ready. You are not good enough. You will fail again. And without even stepping inside, Lucas already felt defeated. This was not his first rejection, and deep down, he believed it would not be his last, because every time he tried, something invisible seemed to push him back, something that made his voice weaker, his posture smaller, his presence forgettable, as if the world had already decided he did not belong among successful people. He tightened his grip on the folder, took a deep breath, and finally walked in. But even as he spoke to the receptionist, his eyes avoided contact. His voice trembled slightly, and his words came out unsure, as if he was asking for permission just to exist. Minutes later, he sat in front of the interviewer, a well-dressed man who barely looked up, asking simple questions that Lucas knew the answers to. Yet somehow, his mind froze, his confidence disappeared, and his responses sounded uncertain, incomplete, almost apologetic, as if he was trying not to take up too much space. And within 10 minutes, it was over. The polite smile, the standard thank you, the quiet signal that he had failed again. Lucas walked out of the building feeling the same heavy weight in his chest, the same question echoing louder than ever. Why does this keep happening to me? He watched as another candidate walked in confidently, shoulders straight, eyes focused, and for a moment, Lucas felt something break inside him. Not anger, not frustration, but something deeper, a quiet acceptance that maybe he was just not meant for success. Maybe some people were simply born with something he did not have. And as he slowly walked down the street, lost in his thoughts, he almost didn't notice the old man sitting on a bench nearby, watching him carefully, until a calm voice suddenly said, "Do you know why you lost before you even walked in?" Lucas stopped, surprised, turning to see the man holding out a small object in his hand. A simple mirror, worn but clear, and without another word, the man placed it in Lucas's hand and said, "Before your next decision, look at this and tell me what you see." Lucas stood there for a few seconds, staring at the small mirror resting in his hand, confused and slightly annoyed. He looked up to ask the old man another question, but the bench was already empty, as if the man had never been there at all. The noise of the city returned around him, cars passing by, people walking quickly, conversations blending into a distant hum. But Lucas felt strangely still, his attention now fixed on the object he was holding. It was simple, nothing special, just a small mirror with a thin metal frame, slightly scratched at the edges. He let out a quiet breath and almost laughed. What was this supposed to mean? How could something like this change anything? Yet something inside him told him not to throw it away. So he slipped it into his jacket pocket and began walking home, his steps slow, his thoughts heavy. That night, he sat on the edge of his bed, replaying the day over and over again, the interview, the silence, the disappointment, and then the voice of the old man echoed again in his mind. Look before every decision. Lucas reached into his pocket and pulled out the mirror, holding it in front of his face. At first, he saw nothing new, just the same person he had always been. Tired eyes, tense expression, shoulders slightly hunched forward. But this time, he did not look away immediately. He kept staring, and slowly, something uncomfortable began to surface. It was not what he looked like, it was how he looked. There was hesitation in his eyes, a quiet fear, as if he was waiting for something to go wrong, as if he expected rejection before it even happened. Lucas frowned, lowering the mirror for a second, then raising it again, this time paying closer attention. When I walked into that building, did I look like someone who believed in himself? He asked. Silently, the answer came without effort. No. When I spoke to the receptionist, did I sound confident? No. When I sat in front of the interviewer, did I act like I deserved to be there? Again, no. And suddenly, the question hit him harder than anything else. If I do not believe I belong there, why would anyone else believe it? Lucas felt a tight pressure in his chest, not from failure this time, but from realization. He had always blamed the outside world, the competition, the lack of opportunity, the unfairness of it all. But now, for the first time, he began to see something different, something deeper, something much harder to accept. Maybe the problem was not just out there. Maybe it started with him, with the way he saw himself, the way he carried himself, the way he spoke before others even had a chance to judge him. He looked into the mirror again, longer this time, and whispered quietly, "Is this really who I am? Or just who I think I am?" And that question stayed with him long after he put the mirror down, because deep inside, Lucas knew something was about to change, but he was not sure if he was ready for it the next morning. Lucas woke up earlier than usual, not because he had somewhere important to be, but because his mind would not let him rest, the question from the night before still echoing quietly. Is this really who I am, or just who I think I am? He sat on the edge of his bed for a moment, staring at the small mirror placed beside him. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to go back to his routine, to blame the world again and move on. But another part of him, a quieter but stronger voice, told him to try something different. So before even standing up, he picked up the mirror and looked into it. Really looked this time. His eyes still carried that same hesitation, that same doubt. But now he could recognize it, and that made it harder to ignore. He slowly stood up, straightened his back slightly, and looked again. The change was small, almost unnoticeable, but it felt different, as if he had taken the first step in a direction he had never considered before. Later that day, Lucas decided to go to a nearby coffee shop, a place he had visited many times before, but always quietly, always keeping to himself. Today, as he reached for the door handle, he remembered the words, "Look before every decision." He paused, pulled out the mirror, and glanced at his reflection. His posture had already begun to sink, his shoulders slightly forward, his gaze uncertain. He hesitated, then took a slow breath and adjusted himself, standing a little straighter, lifting his chin just enough to feel present. Then he walked in. Something about the room felt different, or maybe it was just him. When he approached the counter, he noticed his voice again, softer than it should be, unsure, almost fading at the end of each sentence. He caught himself mid-order, paused for a second, then repeated it, this time clearer, stronger, not loud, but steady. The barista looked at him and nodded with a small smile, a simple reaction. But it felt different. As Lucas stepped aside, he noticed something he had never paid attention to before. People responded to how others showed up, not just what they said. He sat down with his coffee, watching quietly, observing the way people moved, spoke, interacted, and for the first time, he did not feel completely invisible, because for the first time, he was actually aware of himself in the moment, aware of how he was presenting himself to the world. Later that afternoon, he passed by a storefront window and caught his reflection again. Without thinking, he stopped and looked, not with judgment this time, but with curiosity, and something unexpected happened. He did not see a failure. He saw someone who had been acting like one, and that realization changed something deep inside him. Because if it was an act, even an unconscious one, then it could be changed. He held the mirror in his hand again and whispered softly, "If I can see it, I can change it." And for the first time in a long time, Lucas did not feel completely stuck. He felt uncertain, yes, but also aware. And that awareness was beginning to open a door he had never seen before. Over the next few days, Lucas began to notice something he had never paid attention to before, not just in himself, but in everyone around him. Every conversation, every interaction, every opportunity seemed to follow a pattern. People who believed in themselves spoke differently, stood differently. Even when they were not the smartest or the most experienced, they carried something invisible that made others listen. Lucas started testing this idea in small moments, before speaking to a stranger, before making a simple request, before even answering a question. He would pause, take out the mirror, and look at. First it felt strange, almost uncomfortable, like he was confronting a version of himself he had avoided for years. But slowly, that discomfort turned into awareness, and that awareness turned into control. One afternoon, he walked into a small electronics store to ask about a job opening he had seen online. Normally, he would hesitate, maybe walk past the store once or twice before deciding to leave. But this time, he stopped at the door, reached into his pocket, and looked into the mirror. His shoulders were already starting to drop, his eyes uncertain again. But now he caught it instantly. He adjusted, took a deeper breath, stood taller, and walked in without overthinking. When he spoke to the manager, his voice was not perfect. It still carried a slight nervous edge, but it was clear, direct, and present. The manager listened, asked a few questions, and for the first time, Lucas felt like he was actually part of the conversation instead of someone trying to survive it. When he left the store, nothing extraordinary had happened. No job offer, no dramatic success, but something inside him felt different, lighter, more stable, as if he had gained a small piece of control over something that used to control him. Later that evening, as he sat alone, he thought about everything that had happened, and a new realization began to form. Maybe confidence was not something you were born with. Maybe it was something you practiced, just like a skill, just like anything else. The more he became aware of his thoughts, his posture, his voice, the more he could adjust them, and the more he adjusted them, the more the world responded differently. It was subtle, but it was real, and for the first time, Lucas stopped asking, "Why does this keep happening to me?" and started asking a different question, "What am I showing the world about who I am?" He picked up the mirror again, looking into it with a new perspective, and said quietly, "If this is something I have been doing without realizing, then I can learn to do it differently." And in that moment, the idea that once felt impossible, becoming confident, no longer felt like a distant dream. It felt like a process, something he could build, one small decision at a time. But deep down, Lucas knew this was only the beginning, because changing what you do is one thing, but changing who you believe you are is something much deeper and much harder to face. As the days turned into weeks, Lucas continued practicing in small, almost invisible ways, but something deeper began to resist him. It was not the outside world this time. It was his own mind, because even though his actions were slowly changing, his inner voice had not caught up yet. Every time he tried to speak with confidence, a quiet thought would interrupt. "You are pretending." Every time he stood a little taller, another voice whispered, "This is not the real you." And that conflict started to grow stronger. One evening, after a long day of trying to push himself, Lucas sat alone in his apartment, holding the mirror again, staring at his reflection. But this time, instead of adjusting his posture or fixing his expression, he just looked, and for the first time, he allowed himself to be completely honest. "Why do I not believe in myself?" he asked quietly. The question lingered in the air, heavier than anything he had asked before. Memories began to surface, small moments from his past, times when he was ignored, times when he failed, times when he compared himself to others and always felt smaller, weaker, less capable. He realized that his lack of confidence was not just a habit. It was a story he had been telling himself for years. A story repeated so many times that it started to feel like truth. Lucas tightened his grip on the mirror, his expression slowly changing, not with fear this time, but with realization. "What if none of this is actually real?" he whispered. "What if it is just something I kept believing?" The thought felt strange, almost uncomfortable, because it challenged everything he had accepted about himself. But it also opened something new. If his identity was built on repeated thoughts, then maybe it could be rebuilt the same way. He stood up and walked toward the window, looking out at the city lights, thinking about all the people out there. How many of them were truly confident, and how many were simply acting in a way that made others believe they were? The line between real and learned behavior suddenly became unclear, and that realization changed everything. Lucas looked back into the mirror one more time and said, slowly and deliberately, "Maybe confidence is not about becoming someone new. Maybe it is about stopping the lies I've been telling myself." That night, for the first time, Lucas did not try to fix his behavior. He focused on something deeper. He began to question every negative thought that appeared, every doubt, every assumption about his own limits. Instead of accepting them, he challenged them. And although it was not easy, something inside him began to shift. Because once you start questioning the story you have believed your whole life, you can never fully go back to the way things were before. The following days became different from anything Lucas had experienced before, because now he was no longer just changing what he did, he was confronting what he believed, and that was much harder. Every time a negative thought appeared, he stopped, not to ignore it, but to question it. When his mind said, "You are not good enough," he would pause, take out the mirror, look at himself, and ask, "Says who?" At first, The answers came quickly: old memories, past failures, moments of embarrassment. But for the first time, Lucas noticed something important. Those moments were real, but the meaning he gave them was something he had created. He had taken a few experiences and turned them into a permanent identity, and now he was starting to separate the two. One afternoon, Lucas received an email about another job opportunity, a small company looking for someone with basic skills, something he would normally hesitate to even apply for. His first reaction came instantly: "You will probably fail again." But this time, instead of closing the email, he leaned back, took a slow breath, and reached for the mirror. He looked at himself, not with frustration, but with curiosity. "Is this thought helping me or stopping me?" he asked quietly. The answer was clear: it was stopping him. So instead of following it, he did something different. He opened the application and started filling it out, step by step. Even though the doubt was still there, it did not control him the way it used to. As he worked, he noticed something new. Confidence was not about feeling ready. It was about moving forward even when you did not feel ready. Later that day, Lucas decided to practice something else, something that felt even more uncomfortable. He went to a nearby networking event advertised at a local community center, a place filled with strangers, conversations, and opportunities, the kind of place he used to avoid completely. As he stood outside the building, his heart started racing again, his mind filling with the same old fears. But now, he knew what to do. He took out the mirror and looked closely, his posture slightly tense, his expression uncertain, but his eyes were different this time, more aware, more present. He straightened his back, took a deeper breath, and walked in. The room was filled with people talking, laughing, exchanging ideas, and, for a moment, Lucas felt small again. But instead of retreating, he reminded himself, this is just a thought, not the truth. He approached a small group, introduced himself, and joined the conversation. His voice was not perfect, his words not always smooth, but he stayed present. He listened, he responded, and something unexpected happened. People listened back, they nodded, they engaged. Not because he had suddenly become extraordinary, but because he was no longer hiding. As the night went on, Lucas realized something powerful. The world had not changed, but his relationship with himself had, and that changed everything. When he returned home, he stood in front of the mirror one more time and said quietly, maybe confidence is not something you wait for. Maybe it is something you build by refusing to believe the wrong thoughts. And for the first time, that idea did not feel like hope. It felt like truth. Days later, something inside Lucas began to feel different, not dramatically, not in a way others would immediately notice, but deep enough that he could not ignore it anymore. It was not confidence in the way he once imagined, loud or bold or fearless. It was quieter than that, more stable, like a steady ground beneath his feet. And for the first time, he was not constantly waiting for things to go wrong. One morning, as he prepared for another interview opportunity, the same kind that used to fill him with anxiety, he noticed something unusual. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled him. It simply existed in the background, like a distant noise. He stood in front of the mirror, holding it up as he had done so many times before. But this time, he did not search for flaws. He did not try to fix himself. He simply observed. His posture was straight without forcing it, his eyes steady, not perfect, but present. And in that moment, he realized something important. He was no longer trying to become confident. He was starting to act like someone who already was. As he walked into the building, everything felt familiar. The same glass doors, the same quiet lobby, the same kind of people moving with purpose. But Lucas was not the same person who had stood there before. When he approached the front desk, his voice was calm, clear, and natural, not rehearsed, not forced, just real. When he sat in front of the interviewer, he listened carefully, responded honestly, and did not rush to prove anything. He simply spoke as himself, without shrinking, without apologizing for being there. And something subtle but powerful happened. The conversation felt balanced, not one-sided, not like a test he was trying to pass, but like an exchange between two people. When the interview ended, the result did not matter as much as it once did, because Lucas had already noticed the real change. He had shown up differently, and that alone felt like a victory. As he walked out of the building, he passed by the reflective glass again and paused for a second, looking at himself, not with doubt, but with recognition. This was not a completely new person. It was the same Lucas, but without the weight of the story he had carried for so long. He thought about everything that had happened over the past weeks. The mirror, the questions, the small changes, the uncomfortable moments. And one clear truth stood out above all. Nothing outside had magically changed. The opportunities were the same. The people were the same. The world was the same. But the way he saw himself had shifted, and that shift had quietly changed how the world responded to him. Lucas lowered the mirror slowly and said to himself, "Maybe confidence was never something I had to find. Maybe it was something I stopped blocking." And as he continued walking forward, there was one thing he knew for sure. This was not the end of his journey. It was the point where everything truly began to open. The next few days brought something Lucas had never experienced before. Not just small changes, but real results that forced him to confront a new reality. People were starting to treat him differently, not in a dramatic or exaggerated way, but in subtle moments that added up: a longer eye contact, a more engaged response, a sense of respect that had never been there before. At first, Lucas questioned it, wondering if he was imagining things. But as these moments repeated, he could no longer deny it. Something had shifted. One afternoon, he received a call from the company he had recently interviewed with. His heart skipped for a second. The old feeling tried to return, that familiar wave of doubt. But it was weaker now. He answered the call calmly, listening carefully as the voice on the other end spoke. They offered him a position, not the highest role, not something life-changing overnight, but an opportunity, a real one. And for a moment, Lucas stood still, processing what he was hearing. This was something he had wanted for so long. Yet what surprised him the most was not the offer itself. It was how he received it. There was no overwhelming shock, no disbelief, just a quiet acceptance, as if a part of him had already started to expect this outcome. After the call ended, Lucas sat down and looked at the mirror in his hand, turning it slowly as he thought about everything that had led to this moment. The failures, the doubts, the endless loop of negative thoughts, and then the small decisions, the pauses, the questions, the moments of awareness. He realized that the job was not the real victory. The real victory was the version of himself who had shown up differently to earn it. Later that week, on his first day, Lucas walked into the office building once again. But this time, everything felt different, not because the building had changed, but because he had. He greeted people naturally, introduced himself without hesitation, and engaged in conversations without overthinking every word. And once again, the same pattern appeared. People responded, they listened, they included him, as if he had always belonged there. During a quiet moment, Lucas stepped aside and looked into the reflection of a nearby window, not searching for anything, just observing. And what he saw was simple, but powerful. A person who was present, steady, and no longer hiding behind fear. And in that moment, a final realization became clear. Confidence was never something that suddenly appeared one day. It was built in the moments when you chose to act differently, when you chose to question the voice that held you back, when you chose to show up even when it felt uncomfortable. Lucas lowered his gaze slightly and said to himself, "This is who I am now." But even as he said it, he understood something deeper. This identity was not fixed. It was something he would have to continue building every day. Because the moment you stop being aware, the old patterns can quietly return. And as Lucas stood there, holding the mirror one last time, he wondered about the man who had given it to him, who he was, and why he had chosen him. But there was one question that mattered more than anything else. What would have happened if he had never looked at himself differently in the first place? Lucas did not see the old man again. No matter how many times he passed that same bench, no matter how often he looked around as if expecting someone to appear, the place remained empty. But the mirror stayed with him, not as an object anymore, but as a reminder of something much deeper. Weeks passed, and his life continued to move forward, not perfectly, not without challenges, but with a clarity he had never experienced before. Whenever doubt tried to return, and it did from time to time, he no longer accepted it as truth. He paused, became aware, and asked himself the same simple question: is this real, or is this just a thought I have repeated too many times? And each time he asked, the answer became clearer. Thoughts were not facts. They were choices, and the moment you stop believing the wrong ones, everything begins to change. Lucas began to notice this not only in himself, but in others as well. He saw people who appeared confident on the outside, but were quietly unsure within. And he saw others who had less experience, but carried themselves with certainty. And it became obvious to him that the difference was not talent, not luck, not even intelligence. It was belief. The belief you hold about yourself before the world even responds to you. One evening, after a long day at work, Lucas stood in front of his apartment window. Looking at the reflection of the city lights behind him, he held the mirror in his hand for a moment, then slowly placed it down on the table. He no longer needed to look into it the way he once did, because what it had shown him was no longer something outside of him. It had become part of how he saw himself. He took a deep breath and spoke quietly. The way I see myself becomes the way the world sees me. The words felt simple, but they carried a weight he now understood. Every action begins with a thought. Every thought shapes an identity. Every identity drives behavior, and behavior creates results. It was a chain he had lived without realizing. And now, it was a chain he could control. Lucas smiled slightly. Not because everything was perfect, but because he knew something most people never fully realize. Confidence is not something you wait to feel. It is something you choose to act on, long before the feeling arrives. And as he turned away from the window, leaving the mirror behind, one question remained, not just for him, but for anyone willing to ask it. If one small shift in how you see yourself can change everything, then what is the one belief you have been holding on to that is quietly shaping your entire life?